A goddess greets the chosen heroes and welcomes them to this fantasy world. The students look at the goddess. Impressed, screaming, they ask if this is a prank or a dream. They realize that their cell phones are not working. Running around, they notice they are walking on clouds. God opens his angelic wings and tells them not to be afraid. But the demon king was resurrected, bringing fantasy, cause she needed to summon them so they can save the world from fantasy. While everyone is in panic, one of them is left without the goddess then says that they will be summoned in a while there. The saint will receive them by order of the goddess, then says that the saint will be responsible for supporting and helping them at the beginning so that they can adapt to the costume. One of the boys raises his hand wanting to ask a question. ONV. He asks if the status and mission level system exists in that world. The goddess confirms it, and the boy is happy then. Another girl also wants to ask a question. Zhang Mayan asks if that world has a medieval aesthetic with knights and princes. She also confirms. The girl seems strangely interested, but another student raises his hand. The goddess allows him to ask his question. Shui Kongmin asks her if anyone from that group will be stronger than the others and will become a hero, but God denies her, and he asks if everyone there will be heroes, but she says not everyone will receive the same power. She informs that everyone will receive blessing if they are recognized by the gods and will become true heroes. Shui Kongmin thanks him for the answer. The goddess says she will keep an eye on him because he seems to be a hero. Very confident, others are uncomfortable and think that the goddess has already treated him differently. A girl reaches the Shui's side with a question, and Boar thanks the goddess for giving him some of her precious time and says she is the room representative. Smiling, the goddess asks what her question would be. She says that she understands God needs her help, but asks if the goddess could send a message to her parents to inform them. The goddess Fika silent for a moment and says that it would be difficult even for her, and everyone gets scared, asking when they will return to divinity. Smile a little more, saying that the gods who bless them will give them a wish. When they defeat the demon king, everyone starts saying they want to ask the goddess questions, so they raise their hands wanting to ask more questions. She answered everyone's questions calmly until there were none left. The deity asks if their questions are over. None of them seem to have any more questions, but one of them from the back raises her hand a little shyly. The goddess asks what her question is about, but then the boy says it's not a question, but rather a request to be sent back to Earth. The beautiful goddess looks at him a little suspiciously, and she accepts that his wish will be fulfilled when he defeats the demon king. The protagonist is left without grace and then says to do it now because he has no intention of being a hero. The goddess remains silent, and he asks her if it's really possible to return to Earth, and she says yes, but first she wants to ask him a question, because he would want to turn his back on a world with countless lives in danger, just because he wants to get back to his life normal. And then he questions how he could save the world if his parents are worried about their son, and let's stay silent. Watching at this moment, the divinity stops smiling. He approaches and asks what his name is. He responds to be Kingan, and the goddess puts her hand on his face. She looks at the others and asks if there is anyone else who doesn't want to become a hero, and she says to ask humbly now, as she won't force anything on the protagonist. Is shocked to realize that there is no one else besides him. A portal appears behind the protagonist. The deity asks for him to leave since this place is not worthy for him. The others ask him to tell his parents that are they okay? Several people ask, and the protagonist insults everyone from Malucos while thinking that he will warn their parents. He goes through the portal thinking he will be the first to return, facing a forest. He says we'll meet again on Earth. He gets confused, wondering if that is really Earth, and a red paw stomps behind him. Kingan looks back smiling, wondering if that is a wanderer, and asks for permission. He thinks that should have noticed before looking at several wolf men growling or watching, with one of them carrying a elf on the arm who immediately starts to let out moans of pain. Our protagonist thinks that the goddess was just a disgrace who kidnapped students to solve her problems, and she's probably not a goddess. Man. Dog licks its lips and salivates and shouts that now it will have fresh meat, and runs towards the protagonist. As he runs screaming in fear, in a city called Prolonga, a light falls from the sky directly being in the temple, and the students from before appear within time. Someone greets them like heroes from another dimension. A girl welcomes them. She smiles at them, accompanied by a knight, while they call her beauty, and behind her they see a boy who they believe to be a prince. The girl introduces herself as the saint who received orders from the goddess, and the boy next to her comes forward, greeting him, and says it's an honor to meet them, and says he's the prince of the kingdom. Sword Master, his name is Su Sword Master. The girls are excited seeing the prince. Noticing something, the saint asks where the princess is, and the housekeeper is embarrassed, and a girl opens the temple doors and says that ended up drinking and falling asleep. The saint recognizes her as the eternal princess and says that she didn't need to tell him the first time. The princess trips and falls on the floor, and everyone watches her fall. She scratches her head, saying that the floor is slippery since. She says she has never fallen before. The others look at her with a dark expression, and they admit that she is very cute, and she is. Confused, the saint introduces herself as the princess of the Armazim kingdom and says that she will support them with magic. Together with the prince, one of the boys smiles, opening a status window, and I smile, saying that they look like children, and says they will be able to see their levels and status. He sees the curse part, blessing and profits. He understands the which is blessing, but he asks what everything else is. The boy says he will first see the hero's blessing. The blessing allows him translate any language, and your experience gain will be increased. OANV thinks if there is no limit, that is very stolen, and thinks that many other competitors will win the same blessing. Shui Kongmin asks Santa how he could receive blessings from other gods. The saint then says that to do so, they must attract the attention of the gods. Ava's system tells them that a god watches their bodies with a wicked smile. This notification appears for each of them. Observing the messages, they wonder if they are really gods. The saint explains that the ideals of the gods are different, but they all seek to defeat the demon king, and says that should be enough to answer the others' question. Shui Kongmin smiles and says it's really enough. After this, she says the gods watch them and wants everyone to get their blessings. One of them asks what happens if they don't get any blessings, and the saint says she doesn't need to worry about rubbish. The boy is completely embarrassed and remains silent now. For these boys, the adventure in the fantasy world has just begun, and in the forest, King Gonzo runs as fast as he can. And looking at the sky, he catches air as he continues running until he leans against a tree. Tiredly, he says that if he had known something like this would happen, he would have worked out. From 1 second to the next, something flies in front of him, hitting the tree. He observes that it was a spear that got stuck in the tree. Looking back, he sees the wolf men shouting that they want human flesh and tell him to stop, and watching them, he is sure that our protagonist is no longer on Earth. Thinks that that woman who calls herself a goddess never had the intention of sending him back to Earth. Catching some air, he tries think of some solution, and then sweating, he seems to have thought of something. Kong runs back as fast as he can. Think that in this fantasy world, maybe the miracle will happen. Your status window shows your hero blessing and your hero's curse plus a dividend of 2.56. The protagonist observes this and then wonders why it says hero and curse, then sees that his curse causes languages of hostile races to be translated, and his experience is greatly diminished. He thinks this is intentional on the part of the goddess to kill him, since he cannot gain experience in a world that looks like a game while running. He understands what they say and asks himself if you can talk to them, and turn around a little, asking if they can't talk a little. The wolfmen will. They look confused, and he thinks that maybe at work they call him talking lunch, and our protagonist realizes that those guys aren't intelligent at all. He starts to stop running and says he can't run. The wolfmen anymore approach him, and he apologizes to his parents for going before them and blames the goddess, but suddenly something screams and he opens his eyes, confused, and hearing this, he takes an arrow in the leg. The boy looks at the arrow scared and sees several fairies with bow and arrow looking at him. They say something, but he can't understand, and cursing, he wonders what it is that the wolf men say. They are fairies on top of the trees, and the protagonist does not understand. The elves beasts say they are going to eat the elves, and the protagonist thinks he needs to escape with this opportunity. He leans against a tree and wonders what to do now. He asks if he should pray to God, and does so with a face of pain and discomfort, holding the arrow in your leg. He says he would rather die than pray to a god while someone he watches. He thinks that the only choice now is to die there, like that. This someone remains silent while he watches. The system warns him that there is a god watching him. He wonders if he should pray, and while watching the monsters, he says it's better not to say that all this is the goddess's fault. So why should he pray now like this instead of pray to a god? King Gonzo chose to die. A god observes the arrow in the protagonist's leg, and the system warns him he doesn't know what that is, but he cries and asks for help, realizing that when he hears his strange voice, his body becomes moved faster than his mind. The god asks why he is alone, and the protagonist thinks for a moment. He closes his eyes, thinking that it was because of a goddess who kidnapped him, being apprehensive about telling the truth to divinity. Gets confused, and our hero thinks that this thing is probably also a god and is definitely a friend of the goddess. Then he screams in pain, asking to be saved first, as he is hurting so much that maybe he will die next. System warns him that the god is confused, while the protagonist asks if any god could help him. Kong is confused, and the system warns that the god mumbled that there is no other god around. Again, the system warns that The god murmurs that there are no other gods around, and the protagonist asks if he is excluded. The god asks what he is. Excluded, and the protagonist thinks he said too much. The protagonist thinks about how to explain what is excluded. Kong thinks that an excluded person can be someone without a social group, or really without anyone, and maybe they are cursed by. Explain this, but what if he manages to reverse this in his favor? Sweating, he says that an excluded refers to a mobo. He is alone in the forest and the god is impressed. The god says he liked the meaning of the word excluded and the protagonist celebrates that it worked. The divinity puts his hands on his waist and states that it is a shield, and the protagonist wonders if this will really work. The protagonist smiles a little disconcerted and asks to be saved by favor, but the god asks if he is also excluded, and the protagonist watching asks what he is talking about. Asking why would one think that he is a great son, and that he is only alone because his friends are terrible. He is the complete opposite of an outcast. Smiling awkwardly, he says yes, he is an outcast. He says it is because that's why his friends were teleported to the temple, and he ended up there alone, and to get revenge he needed let go of pride and identity. The god decides that he will help the poor soul, and while the monsters scream, the god is conflicted with his past. Our protagonist says that he may think that because he is a god he cannot help a excluded human. He assumes that he only says that because he is in a complicated situation, but it really can be shield. Having friends to give, the divinity says that all the excluded are on the same level, so he raises the hand generating green energy. The god decided to help the poor shield. The green energy covers the arrow, giving off a glow radiant, which scares the protagonist. As soon as the arrow disintegrates, Kangi is amazed that the pain simply went away and says that he really is a god. The protagonist thanks him, saying that his body is lighter, and the other says he is proud. What he's doing, his system window appears, and he wonders why being deleted is a blessing. The blessing of deleted causes all of his conditions to be reset except dying, and something scary will happen if the wolf leaves the forest. Kong thinks that it seems to be very improvised and thinks mainly about which means the lone wolf hiding behind a tree. He asks, if he becomes popular, will he be punished? And the god says he only helps the excluded. Kong sneaks away discreetly while the wolves attack the fairies and says he won't go complain about anything. After all, he wouldn't be able to talk to the monsters, no matter how clearly he hears them. He thinks he was forced to be excluded and ends up stepping on a stick. The monsters hear it and turn around, saying that their food is running away, and the protagonist gets out of there. They tell the human flesh to stop and talk, but he continues running. One of them approaches, trying to catch him, and the protagonist thinks about his blessing. He remembers now that all his conditions will be reset except death. Now not only have his injuries healed, but he also doesn't get tired, even running at full speed. Boy, he must be a monster in bed, right? He realizes that the monsters are getting tired, so they won't be able to chase him anymore. One of the monsters throws a stone, hits him right in the head, and he staggers a little. The god watching him becomes more anxious, falling. Monsters get ready to catch him, but he steps on the ground, getting up again and running at high speed with a smile. Naughty, scaring the monsters. The deity watches, smiling, and he says that this ability is incredible and that he doesn't. He's just saying this to inflate his ego. He says that it wasn't just the bruises and tiredness that disappeared, but he is also strangely calm. Kong thinks out loud that maybe he would bite his tongue if he got caught, but thinks that maybe he won't succeed. God tells him not to die doing this, and Kangon so thanks him, thinking that he won't die, if not all at once. He reaches the edge of a cliff and asks if he is going to die when he jumps off, and the god gives congratulations on him. Thinking about that, the protagonist thinks that the god is a loaf of bread, and at least the monsters have wings. Find him saying that he won't be able to run anymore, and thinks that while he is dealing with the god, he also has a cliff in front of him and monsters behind him. He stays silent, thinking about what he can do, and turns around with his fist closed, telling them to pay attention, and says, "Who will find a way for everyone there to eat, since there are a lot of empty stomachs." He exclaims that taking it first will give you a wonderful part of your body. He says that instead of dividing it, he proposes that whoever catches him first will receive a beautiful part of his body. The monsters laugh and drool, and everyone goes after him. Pushing off the cliff, each one holds a part of the protagonist, arguing which one will be the first to prove the protagonist's flesh, with everyone else jumping along and climbing on top of the protagonist. He thinks that these guys really love human flesh. Holding one of their shoulders, he admits he doesn't hate his obsession. Pulling to fall together from the cliff, several of them begin to fall, and the protagonist laughs as they ask if he is crazy. The protagonist hugs them, laughing as they fall. Kong can't stop laughing while the others they say he's completely crazy. Then everyone falls to the floor, and the protagonist slowly opens his eyes. He sees the other monsters on top of the cliff, and thinks that at least he didn't die on top of the bodies of the monsters. He admits feeling his body being crushed, remembering his blessing and saying it was just imagination. God says that the shield is probably right, but one of the bodies points a sword at the protagonist called Lunch, and he realizes that one of them is still alive. He sees the Estes of the monster with a broken jaw and is impressed by the name Blue Moon Butcher, and says that because of his level 3, it must have been the reason he survived the fall. While picking up a stone, he says that the level normally increases with experience. Lifting the stone says that enemies of higher level are those that give more experience. The saint explains that blessings and levels are the two things that allow you to become stronger. It says that you can increase your level by receiving experience from monsters that have status windows or receiving blessings from gods, while some pay attention and others find Shokongmin boring. She keeps praying in her mind, saying that she is the talented person that everyone is looking for. She also explains that the gods will always be the ones watching, and a girl raises her with a question, and Bora asks if the gods will watch them all day, and the saint confirms, complimenting by asking if even in intimate moments, and the saint says there are no exceptions. Leaving, the boys and girls are scared, but the saint says not to judge the gods as humans since they are not even human. The girl is still scared, and the gods say she is not interested in seeing this. The god of the wind says he is not. Nothing different from the wind, and Bora is still suspicious. So Jiang Mayan says that it's obvious, but at least they will give blessings to those most interesting. She makes a mischievous face, while the gods of evil and evil wind agree with her. Jiang is suddenly scared by a pink light, and looking at her status, she sees a new blessing. Celebrating having received Charm's blessing, then the boys suddenly feel something strange, smelling a smell. They wonder what that has to do with the destruction of the Demon King. She says she has no respect other than her, and the knights also tremble smelling the smell. Jiang makes a sexy pose, saying that the charm skill increases her chance to attract the opposite sex. The saint tells the heroine to stop using her ability, which she accepts. Smiling mischievously, she asks if she does that, and suddenly an innocent goddess disapproves of this behavior, and the saint says it's too late. Jan asks if it's because men have already fallen in love with her. But the saint tells her to look at her status window when she realizes a curse has been imposed on her. They ask why a punishment curse, because they are heroes. After all, the saint says that the gods can also give curses. For those who don't like, the saint says this as she walks towards her, as she was about to explain that a purple palm appears on Jiang's back, and she begins to feel an unbearable pain, saying that the kilo hurts. The punishment greatly increases the damage received and will be received every time you commit an impure act. So Jan screams that she is wrong and apologizes. The gods continue to watch while others remain embarrassed, and the saint tells them to remember that blessings do not disappear until death, and their effects will increase along with the levels that will never descend. Jiang cries, saying that her curse hurts so much even though she's an F rank, but the princess tells her not to give up. She explains to Jan that curses can be overcome by levels, and that the pain will also be less over time, and she asks if it's serious. The princess smiles excitedly, saying that it's clear, and asks her not to give up so easily. Our protagonist, with the bloody stone in his hands, says that that is strange. Wiping the blood from his face, he asks why his level didn't change. He ended up with tons of those monsters that were above his level, and asks if it's because of his curse calling on the god of lone wolves, but the god just says he can. Calling him an outcast, then calling him god of the outcasts, he asks if there is any really useful information. But the god says he can't answer, and Kong just agrees. He says that that god is really useless, but he will hold because of the blessing. So the god responds that running around is boring, and the protagonist agrees, thinking about how he didn't feel thirsty or hungry even though he ran for hours. Then God proposes that he has to do something else, and the protagonist suggests finding someone else. He hides behind a tree where some monsters smell him. The god twists so that the excluded person dies in peace, and the protagonist says that he would hit his mouth if he could. Then prepare his daga. Monsters smell your scent. They smile and salivate, smelling blood, and our protagonist wipes his mouth while smiles, hearing the monsters say that this smell is delicious. The monsters turn around, saying they smell meat. They start sniffing the ground, saying they don't know where it comes from. Kingan so thinks he wants to find a village human, but even with many monsters, he still wouldn't know the way. The protagonist says that in addition to all these problems, the forest is also infested by these monsters. He is also a little stronger and holds a daga that one of the butchers used. The god prays for the protagonist's soul, while he looks up, saying that he doesn't. He's going to die, and he knows that, so he cuts a vine, and he says he doesn't need to follow the rules of the world of fantasy and begins to prepare a trap while God watches with tired eyes. Then he makes a support to his daga and holding the dust with a stone. He asks the god if he knows what centrifugal force is a sound. Then it happens and one of the monsters turns around, turning the stone. He will show these monsters a little bit of science. He became dear stony now. He turns a little destabilized. Kong holds the vine tightly, seeing that it is more difficult than what he thought. His body trembles, and he thinks that with his current vitality he might be dragged away by force if he runs out, swinging too much, but remembers his blessing from the excluded. He prepares himself and spreads his legs and breathing and says that when his blessing is activated his legs stop shaking and he can breathe naturally. Kong thinks he is learning to use the skill of the excluded and says he no longer needs tiredness or cuts. Getting the right stone in the monster's face, ends up exclaiming that he will not die unless he is killed in a beating only the monsters. They say it hurts as he hits them one by one and keeps fighting on the brink of death, but the monsters keep advancing and throwing rocks. Getting hit by rocks, he says they are trying to tire him and that they are smarter than he thought. A little dazed, the monsters took the opportunity to attack him, and when he was about to be attacked and caught, Kong smiled maliciously, then counterattacks with his rock, saying that these tricks won't work. He sighs after defeating all the God assumes that he has raised expectations for him, and the protagonist calls him stingy. He says to someone who is still alive, stop moving if you don't want to be hurt. With a scary look he asks where humans live, but says, which is a useless question since he can easily lie. The monster watches in fear, realizing he can talk, then points and shouts that it's in that direction, and the protagonist thinks he can confirm with another hyena later. The protagonist asks what species he is, and the monster asks if he is stupid. Our hero threatens the monster, who reveals that he is a gnoll and will reveal everything if he spares him. With a fake and innocent smile, he thanks you for telling him so. Hits the rock on his head, saying goodbye. With a little goodbye, he really says it wouldn't hurt if answered truthfully, but never said he would spare the god. So he tells Kong that the monster is a gnoll, and he responds that he already discovered this, saying that wildebeests looked cuter in games. The deity says that a wildebeest calf no is cute, and the protagonist thanks him for the useless information, but he asks why after killing so many of them he still doesn't leveled up. Meanwhile, in the temple, the prince says that training starts tomorrow. The prince will teach swordsmanship and the princess is going to teach magic, and says they can choose which one interests them most. Shoiperg asks if she can learn both, and the prince confirms, saying that he can give up if they are too difficult, and he says he won't give up, and the prince believes in him. OANV. He asks if it's okay not to participate in any classes, and the prince says he can do as he prefers, but then he asks if he can leave the temple whenever he wants. The prince says yes, while Shoi smiles at him, and ANV says he has no more questions and gives a smile back to Shoi. A god immature guy shows interest in ANV in his room. He thinks training is just a bonus for those who don't have skills. Incredible, and says that the protagonist has his own path. The protagonist killing himself in the forest, and the other finding himself special. So he says that as the protagonist he will go out and explore ruins with his cute and kind friends, and gives a wicked smile. The next morning the prince raises his arm and says that anyone who wants to be a knight, just follow him. One of the students asks where the princess is, and the prince says she drank too much last night, saying that she is very hardworking and should arrive soon, and says that anyone who wants to learn magic should wait right there. While they talk about last night, I look at your system and notice something, a blessing called special, that says, being the main character of this world, smiling. He says that his answer is there and comments that Shoi Kmin thinks he thinks very special and wishes him good luck, and leaves the temple stairs and says that if he tries hard, maybe he will deserve the position of his rival. ANV arrives at the city square of Prolonga, smiling, says he is in the right place, opening the gate. Mercenaries Guild. He says that this is where his fantasy story begins, and everyone there hears him say that, but someone recognizes that he is new there. The receptionist asks what brings him to the Mercenaries Guild. Confidently he says, who came to register as a mercenary. Anval says that the initial route for any protagonist is to register so as not to get into trouble, but someone calls him, and he turns around hearing someone say that a newbie like him must be fine anxious, and a red-haired girl tells him to shut up and go back to his hometown, saying that she has already seen several boys like him. They register, and then Dianval thinks that is the buff of the protagonist of his blessing. He is expensive, and the girl asks if he heard her, thinking that that beautiful mercenary is a princess or a high-ranking noblewoman. Disguised position. He smiles, saying that it must be his destiny as protagonist, and that it must be the effect of his blessing. Anval says he doesn't want to go back, and the girl about to complain is interrupted as soon as he tells her to accompany him, since she is so worried. Smiling, while asking her not to judge just by her appearance, saying that she has experienced this several times before, and asks him if it is wrong. She smiles snobbishly at him and admits it, that he discovered her, and he gets all excited thinking he's special. Then he says he can't say much but that it's a chosen, and the girl is confused. He smiles, blushing, thinking he would never be able to talk to a beauty like that on Earth, but there he is, a hero who will save the world. Meanwhile, the immature god is dying laughing. Questioning her, she asks how these chosen skills accumulate, and he says that she will see the protagonist buff. The receptionist remains static in place without saying anything. In the forest, other defeated monsters crawl on the ground. One of them says that the village is in the west and that it is far away. Kong turns his stone, and the monster says that he is strong and that he cannot lies to strong meat. He thanks him for the information, while punching the monster on the ground, saying that these guys are really honest, and that with their ignorance it is easy to identify lies. The protagonist says that the village human is to the west and doesn't know the distance, but confirmed with several knoll during the fights he ended up killing several GNS, and overnight he became an experienced hunter. He smiles, pulling his stone, saying this is some kind of secret talent. The god observes him, and he smiles with satisfaction, saying that he would never have learned to fight so quickly if it weren't for his blessing. But then he wonders how far he still has to go and says he needs to meeting other people. The god mumbles, saying he feels sorry for him, and the protagonist is a little sullen, question if he really wants to see him dead. The deity says he doesn't care what happens, and Kong calls him insensitive. He hears a sudden sound and turns around. A knoll advances towards him, calling meat. Aner pulls his daga, and in a backward thrust he pierces the monster, but they arrive eager for human flesh, and he says that it doesn't matter how many he mate, always appears more and more, preparing for an attack. He cuts both GN at once, saying that it's very strange, and you wonder why you can't level up even though you've killed so many monsters. Restless, the protagonist begins to hear voices of friendly races that he cannot understand and asks if they are the fairies of Aints. He decides to approach carefully so as not to receive another arrow without warning from behind a tree. Observes and sees a group of 3 people, 2 swordsmen and an archer. The archer notices their presence, firing an arrow in the tree where he hides. He watches the arrow with a scared look. They try to say something to the protagonist, and he says he's just looking for a village. Kong remembers that they can't communicate and says, who are the first humans he encounters. He decides to hide his daga. The warrior asks him something he doesn't understands, but Kong bends down, kneeling and surrendering with his hands up, saying he is against violence. He knows that it doesn't make any difference to say this, but still body language can also be used to communicate. Sweating cold, he realizes he can't communicate, but he thinks he should at least try. The group can talk about something he doesn't understands. The archer raises his crossbow and says something apparently threatening. He covers his head, asking to wait, saying that it's a good thing and that it won't hurt anyone. Can go on, so starts walking with the group. They try to say something that he doesn't understand. The girl says the protagonist's name and something insensitive, and he asks what it would be in a friendly way. The 2 talk to the protagonist, but he doesn't understand anything other than his name. The biggest one says something that the protagonist agrees, and he says he managed to tell them his name, but he no longer understands anything they say. Feeling relieved to have found friendly people, he no longer has to worry so much about running into monsters. The god sulks and says they are probably stronger than someone level 1 like him. The deity says he doesn't look anything like the loner. Our protagonist just agrees, and the god whimpers, asking so he doesn't speak so coldly to him. Kong laughs, saying that it's normal to be more casual with someone you're close to, and the god tells him not to act like they are close. He says he has met people, but he can only talk to this one god. From body language, he discovered that the big guy's name is Guri. He assumes that Guri is the leader of the group and admires the huge sword he carries, admitting that this must be the standard of this world. He observes the muscles of Gu and wonders how strong he is, which makes the god laugh, saying that he obviously doesn't compare to a god after all. They are mere humans. The other swordsman calls, coming to his side and hugging him, saying something and laughing. His name is Call. Call is a fit and strong guy who laughs often and seems to wear swords in each hand. The girl call her, she says something, but he calling her Misa says he didn't understand anything. Misa is a long-distance warrior, and from the weapon she uses he believes she probably fights people. She points into the distance and he looks, seeing 2 signs of white smoke. Our protagonist thinks that if it isn't fire in the forest, it must be chimneys, and says that he finally found places where other humans live. The god mentions that he is not acting like an outcast, and the protagonist Moxley asks for forgiveness from the deity. Looks at him with disgust. Kong admits that he is pretending just to get out of this forest. Everyone else is on alert with a sudden sound, and Kong is confused until several genus monsters run towards him. They growl and drool in the direction of the group. Group gets ready and says something that it is not possible to understand, shouting something to Kingonso, and he just laughs saying that. There are many. He doesn't see many from the cliff, and thinks they were waiting for an ambush, but Gu and Call advance towards the protagonist. They stand in front of him saying something and, protecting Guri, he attacks the GNS with his giant sword. Call jumps over Gu, while the Nus call them meet. They give a command to separate. While Call attacks them from top to bottom and hits one of them who screams, the two stand side by side protecting the behind each other while several Nus surround him. They say it hurts too much and shout to wait until the meet get tired, but one of them receives an arrow in the forehead and screams loudly. Kong watches Misa reloading her bow and she soon Mira again. The monsters say that small meat is dangerous, and the one who received the arrow tells the others, "Don't get closer." Misa pulls out another arrow and weapons her crossbow until one of them shouts her name and she looks back. Seeing a huge gnoll approaching to attack, Call shouts something worried, but before the attack hits, Kong stops him. God is uncomfortable, and Kong asks him to let it go since humans are social animals. The gnoll growls with hatred, and Kong says he needs to help these people. While the gnoll goes on the attack, he dodges the attack with a insane speed, sticking the dagger right into the gnoll's jaw, and the god says that it's not his problem. The gnolls say that the weak flesh is actually strong, and the protagonist says that that is also true, but that they are coming together. With level 1 after the battle, Gur and Call observe the bodies of the monsters on the ground. The protagonist says that apparently everyone is safe. Guri and Ols turn to him, and Kong says that if it weren't for them he would be in problems. He gets confused when he sees them aiming at him. The protagonist looks at Misa and says she must be joking since they worked so hard against the gnoll, but she says one last sentence, firing an arrow in the direction, hitting Kong in the heart. He falls back and the group talks about something. Kong admits that that world of fantasy is shit. The wind shakes the trees. The group observes Kang's body lying on the ground. Call says that the first plan went wrong because of the monsters, and Misa, smiling, says that that was good after all. With the monsters they found out how dangerous he was. She says she thought he was weak at first sight, but even though she didn't understand his language, she realized that he was better than expected. Guri states that it would be more dangerous if they followed the original plan, and Call, smiling, says that it's a pity, but they couldn't do anything. After all, he would probably resist being sold as a slave. Guri says too. They take the dagger, but Kolai says it's probably rubbish. The big guy says that since they didn't sell him into slavery, they can at least take your belongings. Besides, it could be a valuable item, he deduces. Call and Misa give a weak smile, and Gu asks them to trust him because that daga had adornments of the royalty of the fairies. The double swordsman approaches, asking if it's serious, and the other says that even if it's fake, they'll probably go make good money, and tells him to go quickly. He agrees but smiles, realizing something. He says that even in death he left the gun, and Misa tell him to be careful. After all, the shot wasn't in the heart. She screams that he might still be alive. But Kolai raises his sword to Kang's body and thrusts the sword in, saying that this should suddenly solve the window. Kang's status window opens before Kolai. Kong explains to us that, or you have an ability to see the status window from someone else, or you let the other person see your status window. The blonde is surprised for a moment, and our protagonist tightens the handle of his sword, saying that he has one condition to see the window. He attacks Cole by sticking his dabia on his neck and reveals that he needs to be alive for his status window to be shown. Guri and Misa are scared of our protagonist, pulls the dagger from Call's neck. As he falls, the other two scream for their fallen partner. They then fall. Armam, asking if Kangi is a demon. Guri shakes his hand, saying he is tired from the last battle, and Misa shouts at him, "Pay attention to the front." When Guri look, our protagonist is already within his reach, smiling in an evil way while attacking Guri's neck. But when he stands up, he receives another arrow in the right chest. He smiles in a psychotic, pulling the arrow out of his chest, saying Misa's name, but she doesn't understand what he's saying and starts to shake. Out of fear, she walks back, saying she made a mistake, but our hero keeps asking questions that she doesn't understand. With a scary expression while holding the arrow, he makes her more scared by asking her please. She falls into the ground crying and asking for forgiveness, begging to spare his life. He looks at her with a serious look and says something that she doesn't understand. She smiles, terrified, asking what he is saying, asking a monster like him to forgive. Kong takes off her clothes and says that it hurt a lot, and that she really used something so lethal on a simple human. He puts on Misa's clothes, saying they are uncomfortable, and God laughs, saying he respects his hobby. Awkwardly, he says that this is not a hobby, and that her physique was the most similar to his, as the other two had heavy armor. Too much with the crossbow in his hand, He thinks he might be able to use it, and will take it with him. He says he doesn't know why. They tried to kill him, but in the last few seconds the status window appeared and disappeared, saying that she had a blessing. Even though she is not a heroine, he wonders if receiving blessings is something common in this world. The god says that doesn't care about this type of subject and asks where he's going, and our protagonist says that as planned he goes to the village, lifts a bag of money, saying that he even achieved something even without being able to communicate, and that this money will help when they arrive in the city. God reminds him not to forget what happened when he tried to stop being an outcast in the temple first. Apologizes for being late, being in front of the students. She starts explaining what magic is. She says that in the past there was no magic, while she explains some of them talk that if you apply calculations to a spell, you can become an archmage very quickly. A nerdy boy says he protected his purity for this reason, and another boy laughs, saying that he believes it wasn't on purpose. A nerdy girl says that magic is chemistry and will show atomic magic to all of them. The girl complains that they are disturbing the class, and the boy mocks, saying that she won't become an AR Magaga just because she knows the history of magic. Another boy agrees. Orda saying that she needs to have talent for this, and the girl is uncomfortable. The princess claps her hands to call the staff attention. She says that talent is really important, and how talent is what matters most when it comes to magic. The story about the founder of magic is also very necessary. Everyone is confused, wondering what the princess meant by this was repeating that in magic talent is the most important thing, and making a flame in her hand. She says that what decides this talent is your lineage and your educational connections, telling them to remember. Furthermore, she says that talent is natural from lineage and artificial from her education. Her name is Athena Armazan, and she is the descendant of the founder's third husband. She has both lineage and connections, and says that the heroes and her disciples will have high potential. And Bora raises his hand with a question, and the princess allows him to say the question is, if without education and lineage it is still possible to become a magician. The other students comment that that is a good thing. He asks, but it doesn't matter. The princess remains silent due to the commotion and then smiles excitedly, saying that it is possible. She takes Eubora's hand, saying that she will explain later. Holds her hands and says that Eubora is a hero, and she agrees. The princess closes her eyes and says that from now on the heroine will be in a learning relationship with her, and Bora feels a magical breeze and a magic circle forms behind her and the princess that says that from now on she is Athena Armazim's first apprentice. The other students are impressed by falling backwards and ask her to do a magical oath. Closing her eyes slightly, she swears, making a strong light shine on her body, and Bora stays with her eyes closed after that. And when she opens them, the princess congratulates her, saying that she is now a magician complete, and Bora is completely confused, asking what happened. The Eubora system shows that now she possesses the blessing of Han-Si magic, and the animated princess says that those who become apprentices earlier receive more talent, and Bora realizes that after they declared their learning relationship, Hank's blessing appeared, and the princess confirms that this is her talent. She concludes that if you don't have relatives or a master with the blessing of magic, it won't be possible to become a wizard. The princess says that's why talent is so important, and Bora understands. The princess closes her eyes and performs fire magic with her right hand. Says that the founder who became a goddess of magic left blessing for her descendants and students by increasing the size of the fireball. She says an ordinary mage will use this magic easily, but with the blessing this is called white magic. The students are impressed, but it has something. The last thing to say is raise your left hand and shake a little, making a small purple one that floats over your hand. Strangely, her hand begins to shake as the flame increases until her gloves begin to deteriorate and her hands crack. They get scared, asking what is that. The princess shaking says she asked if talent was always necessary, wasn't it? And Bora puts his hand over his mouth, scared. The princess says that in reality, right hand is white magic with the blessing, and in the left hand is black magic without the blessing, until someone shouts, scaring the boys even more. One of the maids pulls her cheeks, reminding her of the rule of not using magic. Black, a priest, runs towards the princess, who says he only used it because it would be easier for the heroes. Understand. The maid then says that she will report it to the queen, and the princess apologizes, begging not to speak to her mother, while the priest heals her left hand, and Bora apologizes, feeling guilty for having done the asks, but the princess says that there is no problem with that, and is happy that they now understand the dangers of magic. Black. She recovers herself, and the students ask what black magic is, if it is an evil power, but the princess says it is not evil but a power of nature. Meanwhile, Kanganu arrives at the city. The guard says something and extends his hand. To him, he understands a little of what the guard means and hands over 4 silver coins that seem to be accepted. Gratefully walking through the city, Kong sees several people running, armed, thinking that it must be because of the forest and carnivorous plants. He finds the place indicated at the entrance and is grateful that the sign is a image. At night, he says that the money is great and that you can be friends with anyone even without being able to speak. God is uncomfortable, and the protagonist smiles slightly. Kong says he is uncomfortable too and asks, what gender is the god, making it even more uncomfortable? But Kong says he will think of the god as a man too. Protecting his own dignity, he then rubs his arm, trying to remove a stain of blood that won't come off. The god seems worried, and Kong questions him, but the system warns him that the god hides a secret in his heart. Until on the other side of the door, the protagonist hears someone talking and understands, getting scared, the voice talking with someone. He thanks the person and says that being the mayor, he will take care of things there. The protagonist and the god remain silent. He shouts that he is taking a shower and asks the person outside to wait. The person heard that he is not spoke the language but ignores it and says he understood. Kong gets dressed quickly. He takes his daga and says that someone he was with. He can talk. He is behind the door. He positions himself. As he walks, the fact he can understand what the person speaking can only mean one thing, that the person on the other side of the door is not human but rather a race hostile to person on the other side of the door imagined that he did not speak their language. The protagonist emphasizes in his mind that that thing behind the door is a race hostile to heroes and says it could be monsters like the nose or maybe demons. He sweatily looks at the door and then unlocks it. The god looks at him intensely while he is sitting on the bed and gives authorization for anyone outside to enter. He hides his daga behind himself. The person asks for permission. While opening the door, our protagonist stands still, watching, imagining what monster he will see, and says that he won't. It matters whether the race is friendly or hostile to the heroes. After all, they are all dangerous to him. But what matters is whether he can have a normal conversation with them. He asks what happened, and the man tells him not to worry. After all, he is the leader of this village, and he came to take a look at the traveler who doesn't know how to speak their language. Kong says that understood and wonders if he is a normal human or a monster in disguise, and notices that he looks very young. The man sees the status window and says that his name is very unique, making the protagonist feel embarrassed. He states that the protagonist should hide his status window, and he is surprised to learn that it is possible to hide. The old man says, who expected to be a used fairy, but he must be just a shaved leg from afar, and the protagonist sees that he looks disappointed. This village has a terrible history with fairies. It turns out that the gnomes who lost their homes to fairies went to human territory, and several people who lost their families ended up taking refuge there to reunite and take revenge. Protagonist with frustration saying that people don't even remember the past grudge, and most of the city are newbies. Now before the man goes, he has a question for the protagonist. He shows a potion and says that it has been a while since he ate the food with that paralysis potion, and then asks why it had no effect. The protagonist raises his hand. Daga quickly goes after the man, who smiles slightly when he sees the blade stopping close to his neck, saying, that was impressive. Kong is confused looking at his shaking arm. He says that fairies are high resistance to potions, and that this is a magic that he developed so he can give up. After all, that is not something that can be overcome by resistance to potions. He pulls the protagonist's dagger, who asks how the man says he isn't his fault, but he was very unlucky. The god says he tried to warn, and the protagonist remains silent elsewhere. The man says that people are angry at the Nus for killing their families and robbing their homes. Explains that in fact the Nus are victims like humans. The tied-up protagonist stares at him while he says that the culprits are those who dominated the gnomes' territory. He observes 2 people tied up and says that the fairies are the real enemies. The man tells Kong to look at his status window, seeing the name Kinson level 16 and a lunatic's blessing and a fairy's curse. He wonders what that curse is and sees that it is one of those who are enemies of the fairies and receive more damage and resentment from them. Our protagonist asks if a god did that, but the man says that it is the grudge of the fairies he murdered. Kong smiles, forcefully saying that he is not a fairy. While he thinks that every curse has a meaning, he says he shouldn't say ISO to a random stranger, but the man puts the dagger right in front of the boy's face. The man says he doesn't intend to say much to him, but changed his mind when he saw the dagger and asked the protagonist where he got it. Looks to the side thinking he got it a knoll called Blue Moon Butcher, but seeing the people trapped, he thinks he's not stupid enough to say something like that. He looks at the dagger thinking that survival is the main thing now. With the dagger around his neck, he says he got it after killing a fairy who shot him, and says they are comrades with a common enemy. The old man says he is impressed that he killed a real fairy with his skills, and the protagonist asks if the fairy was from royalty. The man laughs, asking if he really didn't know that. He assumes that the more he hears the protagonist, the less he wants to kill him, and the boy asks him to spare him. But the man says it's a shame he saw his window status and that he is a mage without a blessing. The protagonist doesn't understand, and the man says that he really doesn't know nothing, and the boy explains that it's because he's an outcast and thinks there aren't enough cool people or gods to teach him about this world. But the old man asks what that is, and the boy explains that he is a lone wolf running through the vast forest. The old man laughs, saying it's a nice word, even if he can never run through the forest again, and the protagonist is confused. The deity prays for the protagonist to have luck in the next life, and he asks what's wrong with the people in this place. The old man waves his hand, lighting several candles with a flame green. One of the chains comes loose and a woman falls to the ground. Suddenly, the old man steps on top of her, and with one of the candles, green flame in his hand, he says he is a black magician and that he needs to sacrifice him to prolong his life. Smiling from a diabolical way, he says that the curse is consuming him, but he manages to face it forever by doing more sacrifices. Looking at the boy, he says that because he dealt with a real fairy, he will be sacrificed without feeling pain. And the protagonist smiles, thanking the man for his kindness. The protagonist says he is very kind. That's why he smilingly says that he may have been left by a god with a strange personality, but the worst part is that he can still speak. He calls the leader. The man looks at him and asks if he wants to beg for his life. But he shouts that he obviously doesn't want that and says that it's not really that. The man turns to him intrigued and says to him, "Go ahead, who wants to hear the last words of a man who will soon die?" But he looks to the side, hearing a sound, and says that the insects are a little noisy. So with the whip in his hand, he starts to whip the fairy that is on the floor. Kong remains silent, watching the scene. After that, the old man says he is finally quiet, and looking at the protagonist asks what he wanted to say. Protagonist thinks that the old man's actions are not normal and that perhaps he wants to show who the true side of justice is. The boy then says that his journey must have been difficult, mainly because no one recognizes his effort. Smiling, the old man asks if he really understands him. He explains that it is because he is an outcast that man thinks this means a lone wolf running through the vast forest. Understanding, he deduces that he is also an outcast. The god says that it is certainly not that, and the protagonist agrees, but at least managed to make the old man have happy empathy. The old man says he really liked the protagonist, but says that as a excluded, he must remain a lone wolf, and the boy thinks that now he wants to kill him just to continue being an outcast. God are endlessly, and the boy says it's not the time for that. Excitedly, the old man says finally found someone who understands him and says that as his partner he needs to watch this. The protagonist agrees, thinking it only made things worse. Kinson, looking around at the fairies hanging, seems to look for something and says to a man prisoner who should go with him since he has been feeling so bad lately. The blonde angrily says something incomprehensible. The old man says it won't work and that his comrade needs to live to entertain him. With his hands covered in blood, he hold the chain, releasing the fairy right in the middle of a magic circle, touching your fingers and smiling, saying it will begin now, asking the mother of life to allow him to receive the rest of this fairy's life. The protagonist wonders about the magic circle shining in front of him. The man faces the fairy inside the magic circle and then asks her declare that she will give the rest of her life to him. The fairy looks at him scared. Kneeling down, the old man promises who will send his friend to be by his side soon, and smiling in a macabre way, grabbing his hair, says that the fairy knows what will happen if she refuses her pity. The fairy cries and seems to accept the deal. The old man says that the pact has been established. Our protagonist wonders what is happening to the leader and then asks what's going on. He wonders if he's getting younger with the life he's taken from F and raise your face, asking if failed by stepping on the fairy's body. He tells Kangon so that his magic was a success. But he looks at the old man and says he doesn't look any younger, and the man smiling says it's because he doesn't. It's human. Coming close to the protagonist, he says that not only did he extend his life, but he asks if he even knows how many lives of fairies and travelers he took to this village, saying that it was to the point that his curse became deplorable. The protagonist recognizes him as someone who doesn't give up, but he doesn't agree with these methods at all. The old man explains that when he received the curse, he ended up becoming sick and old in an instant, but a traveling magician suggested a experiment. The old man opens his shirt, and the protagonist observes, asking what he is doing, and realizes that what he is doing is not. In the middle of his chest is a knoll, which the old man confirms by saying that he is actually a knoll. Confused, the boy asks if he is really a hybrid race, and the man shouts that he is the combination of a human and a gnoll, the two races that most hate fairies in this world, and with his gnoll body and human mind, he will have his glorious revenge. But the protagonist, he asks if he will do everything alone, and the old man says that it is more than enough, because his black magic is supreme, and that he will hunt the fairies with his own power. The boy assumes he is not a fairy, and the old man tells him not to worry about these small details, and then squeezes the protagonist's shoulder tightly, saying that because of you he discovered about his true identity as an outcast, and says he will never forget him, and as thanks he will make good use of his life. The protagonist begins to break out in a cold sweat, asking if he is still going to kill him. The excited man says yes, after all he is an outcast. Our protagonist becomes serious and frowns, thinking that a true outcast is very dangerous and that this is the moment of his destiny. Princess Eaton Armin is a genius in the magical kingdom and is greatly admired by the workers. They don't reveal this part, it seems to be a secret, but she hardly has any free time because she is a princess, and because of her talent, she didn't even have to make an effort to get what she wanted. But what would it be? And Bora says that magic is created by the imagination, as she explained, but asks if there aren't more ways to increase her efficiency, and Bora is trying hard to win over the princess. That's why she chose her as her first apprentice. The princess is happy and says that the question is great, but replies that she just needs to follow the tips of her teacher or her parents. She makes a white light in her hand, and the students are impressed by the magic, wondering if that is a new magic. The princess so makes an ice rabbit in her hand, and Bora is impressed by the ice magic. Armazim family received talents from their ancestors and were able to use fire magic in common with each generation, but it explains that his unique magic is ice and asks if they want to try, and brings his hands closer, trying, but he says no. Being successful, the boring princess says that she is not used to being a teacher. She explains that the more experience she gains, more will be for them, and asks if they understood, and Bora says yes and thanks them for the explanation. But the princess says it was nothing. Someone calls the princess, attracting the attention of the two. Jiang Mayan asks if someone does not receive any blessing, what needs to be done. Everyone says they are in this situation and ask for blessings, saying that they want to be treated equally. The princess smiles, holding her ice rabbit, and then takes it to her mouth, leaving the scared students chewing. She asks who will be her second apprentice, and one of the students says it will be him, until everyone starts shouting, saying to be chosen as their second apprentice. All the heroes shouted at once, crying out to Princess Athena, but with one word she stopped the shouting and made them fight between themselves, and her says to let her know when they've decided, and asks if she did that on purpose. And with a face apparently normal, the princess asks what she meant by that, and says so only to leave aside. The princess says to finish the class now. The princess showed her ice bunny a unique magic that is only acquired after a lot of training, and asks him if it's like black magic. Scared, the princess ends up making a serious face, the heroine. He asks what happened, and the princess says that black magic is different from white magic because it is impossible to achieve good magic level practicing, since it requires a sacrifice each time you use it. Returning to Kong, he gets a worried expression, busy in the middle of the magic circle, and the old man calls his name, extending his hand and asking him verbally declare that you will give your life to him. Kong thinks that consensus and sacrifices is something important in magic. Black woman, the man says that he does not physically own his life since he does not own it, and says that their conversation ends there, and now exclaiming for him to declare. Our protagonist thinks he will die if he stands there, and that he needs prevent. Confidently, he tells the man to wait, and says he has one last request to make. The old man gets confused and asks what is. Kong says that before he dies, he wants to see Misa one last time. The old man remembers her as an adventurer from Giant Beast and says it's an interesting request, and asks why he wants it. Nervously, Kong says it's her boyfriend. The surprised old man asks if he's really her boyfriend, but laughs softly, taking the protagonist by the collar of his shirt. He says he knows everything that happens in that village since he is the leader, and says he knows what Call is her boyfriend, and asks Kong not to abuse his goodwill with this dirty little lie. The protagonist gets slightly irritated, thinking that he was already out of his mind, but the old man was still doing a good job. Kong smiles slightly, saying that he got something even better, stating that Kolai is Misa's ex. The old man doubts and asks if he is really her boyfriend, and asks for proof. Kong suggests that the old man smell him to find out. At the same time, he realizes that there really is no way the smell of Misa could be on his body without them being lovers, and he ends up apologizing. After all, he supposes that if Misa disappears, Guri and Kolai would be the suspects. Kong anew agrees, and thinks he doesn't believe that the old man planned all of this and that he is scary and incredible. The old man asks him. He asks if he doesn't have any other desires, and Kong says that if he survives, would like to be released until he finds Misa. The protagonist assumes that he cannot think absolutely anything other than that. The old man accepts and promises that he will fulfill his part. So Kong declares that it is a deal made. The old man puts his hands together, smiling. Excited mode and a pressure takes over his entire body. He feels immense pain, creaking in pain and cursing the man, remembering that he had said it wouldn't hurt at all, but he feels enormous pain in his body. The protagonist begins to feel bend down, and the old man wakes up saying that he will tell Misa that he went to a place very far from there, but smiling Kong says that this will not be possible as the Misa went to a very far place before he was surprised. The old man asked something, but before he finishes, Kong prepares a punch and hits him directly in the chin. The old man staggers in pain. Angry with the protagonist with his hand on his chin, he accuses Kong of having deceived him, but Kong says it was the old man. Who was it? Deceived first, he thinks he almost went crazy because of that pain he felt, saying that that kind of pain would easily turn a friend into an enemy. Surprised, the old man asks how he survived that, and the protagonist, getting ready, says that in hell, he will know, thinking that his magical restriction is gone. The blessing of the excluded restarts until even the life expectancy that was reduced with his hand on the wall. The man says he is just a mere beginner who survived by a thread. Kong points to the old man and says he has a promise to let him walk free if survived, and taking his dagger says it's time to fulfill his part of the promise. He puts his hand on his chin thinking and looks to one of the fairies, saying that she is the winner. He raises his dagger towards her and strikes, cutting the chains that were on her wrists. She wonders something. Kong takes her by the arm and says she finally has a witness. He realizes that she is too weak to walk, so he puts her on his shoulders, and she screams something, but the protagonist ignores her. Running towards the exit door, the old man turns to him, asking where he thinks he is going, shouting that he can't do that. The protagonist tells the old man to keep his promise and thinks he is safe until he finds Misa. But there is no way to find someone who has already died. With a frown, the old man remembers the promise and says that something like this promise can be annulled if he returns what was taken from him by releasing something black from his hand that ends up attaching itself to the protagonist. Kong thinks that really wasn't a bluff. The old man says he is disappointed as he should have just given up and had a death in pain. Kong asks if it's serious and thinks it's a little early to give up when suddenly the old man feels a weakness in the body, begins to spit blood from the mouth, and wonders what that is. He opens his eyes. His life begins to fade away, leave his body, and he screams in pain, falling to his knees on the floor, feeling his strength leaving. The protagonist look up and asks the old man what that is. They both look up, seeing a red glow, and Kong says that that is the strength of the old man abandoning him. The old man with the most wrinkled face says he cannot believe in what anyone would come out unharmed after stealing so many lives. He screams, asking the protagonist if he is some kind of vampire with an infinite life expectancy, asking what he is. Kong calmly thinks about what he is. God tells him to stop worrying, finds so much, and Kong thinks that this God is already annoying him a lot, but then he decides and says he is the apostle of the excluded. The God is shaken with shame, and Kong is happy for that. The old cosp blood, and our protagonist says that if he defeats someone at level 16, he will gain a lot of experience. He decides to focus on getting out of there until he hears someone saying he won't forgive him. Kong is surprised and looks in the old man's direction. The knoll in his chest says he's going to kill him and that he destroyed his dream. And now for the protagonist's minced meat with a red aura around the old man's arm. He advances towards Kong, shouting that he is going to kill him, and the protagonist throws the fairy away from there. He ends up receiving an attack on the chest, making him kneel. While Noel says he knows he is impressed, he explains that that power is the Noel swordsmanship, and that he was saving to hunt the fairies. The protagonist looks at the blood and says, "This is sad." The gnome is scared by the protagonist, asking how he is alive if the attack should have been fatal, and Kong says that it was really risky. The old man gives in his teeth, thinking that he is already without strength. He turns to run, but a hand holds his leg. Looking down, he sees Fadu assuring her and curses her while she says something. He shouts for her to let go, but our protagonist is already behind him, and when he sees it, the blade is already arriving and cuts off his head. The fairy is impressed to see it, but Kong knows he can't stop. After all, the gnome still has one more head. With a weak voice, he calls for his daughter, saying he can't take revenge, and then says he loves her, but Kong wants him to rest in peace and ends it. The god says this is a shame, and the protagonist agrees. He turns back putting his daga close to his shoulder. The fairies begin to loosen up and talk. The protagonist freed them and called the villagers, and even the militia came to examine the situation. And he was leaving as it seemed that the situation was almost resolved, but then they start shouting at him. He turns around smiling, and everyone looks at him with a serious and dark look, which makes him. Protagonist doesn't understand, but he says that was a moment ago, and now he's running, stopping at the edge of a cliff. He asks what those annoying fairies are saying, and at sunrise he looks down the cliff, thinking that one day he will catch them. He gets ready and jumps away from them all while claiming to hate this world of fantasies. Subscribe to the channel for more videos. See you next time. Bye bye.